This is John Sadler, and I'd like to welcome you to our video on construction defect in general liability insurance. Let's get started by defining what construction defect means. Construction defect is defined as property damage to your work. In the case of a builder, your work is normally the entire house or construction project. The cause of construction defect is usually defective design, defective product, or defective installation, or a combination of all three. Property damage to your work is evidenced by problems such as fire damage, water damage, moisture damage, bending, warping, cracking, breaking, sagging, chipping, fading, peeling, mold, fungus, pollution, and so forth. The building industry is constantly experimenting with new building products and techniques in an effort to reduce cost, become more efficient, and to add value. Sometimes these products don't stand the test of time, and unforeseen problems can arise that result in construction defects. Examples include EIFS, or synthetic stucco, masonite, Georgia Pacific siding, polybutylene plumbing, and more recently, Chinese drywall. The full weight of the construction defect crisis began to be felt by the insurance industry about 10 years ago. Regionally, in the Southeast, the first wave of large-scale lawsuits arose over EIFS, or synthetic stucco. The insurance industry fully funded a plaintiff attorney's gravy train in this area, since most of the cost were covered by insurance policies of the manufacturers, distributors, builders, and installers. The EIFS epidemic seemed to fuel more and more construction defect lawsuits of all different types. As a result, two trends emerged. The first was that most insurance carriers left the marketplace and refused to write general liability insurance for builders, since they reasoned that they couldn't make a profit at any premium level. A perfect example was the Maryland Casualty Zurich program known as HBIS. They were the leading insurer of builders in the country, and they just closed shop. The second was that the carriers that remained in the market for builders learned a lesson from the EIFS epidemic and decided that they didn't want to be a funding source for another plaintiff attorney's feeding frenzy. They decided to attack the problem by adding a multitude of exclusions to the policy form to reduce and/or eliminate coverage for construction defect lawsuits. The first is the EIFS, or synthetic stucco exclusion. This exclusion has appeared on all builder policies for many years. If you're a builder and are still installing EIFS or doing EIFS repair work, you need to buy a special general liability policy from the high-risk marketplace to cover this exposure. The next is the soil movement exclusion. Expansive soils have been a problem in some parts of the country and have been a major source of construction defect lawsuits. It's possible to pick up coverage for this risk through certain homeowner warranty products such as HBW 210. The fungus, mold, and mildew exclusion was added almost immediately when the toxic mold lawsuits began to appear. This exclusion effectively cut off the builder's general liability policy as a funding source for plaintiff attorneys looking to make toxic mold the next EIFS gravy train. This exclusion is usually limited to property damage, so it's possible to still have some coverage if the lawsuit papers allege bodily injury or sickness in addition to property damage. If this is the case, the policy will typically provide legal defense for the entire lawsuit, but will only pay any settlement or adverse jury verdict attributable to the bodily injury portion of the damages. If you're concerned about this exclusion, you can buy a special mold and pollution liability policy from the high-risk marketplace that has a minimum premium that starts out in the $2,500 to $5,000 range. The absolute pollution exclusion is a powerful exclusion that can have consequences well beyond what you normally think of as pollution. This is exemplified in the recently emerging Chinese drywall crisis, where it's alleged that drywall from certain plants in China release noxious fumes that cause corrosion of metal in the home, a foul-smelling odor, and health problems. Pollution is defined as any solid, liquid, or gaseous contaminant or irritant. The insurance carriers plan on denying these claims by using the absolute pollution exclusion. Once again, If you're concerned about this exclusion, you can buy a special pollution liability policy from the high-risk marketplace. The products and completed operations exclusion has the most devastating impact of all the exclusions and is not acceptable. Quite simply, this exclusion eliminates coverage for all bodily injury and property damage that occurs after the home has been sold. You definitely don't want this one on your policy. And finally, the most complicated and difficult to understand of all the construction defect exclusions is called damage to your work performed by subcontractors on your behalf, which is also known as form number CG 2294. I will refer to this exclusion as CG 2294 from now on in this video. Before I explain this exclusion, I need to take a minute to review the basic property damage to your work exclusion under the General Liability policy prior to the introduction of CG 2294. For many years, the standard General Liability policy form, when issued to a contractor, has had Exclusion L, which takes away coverage for lawsuits alleging property damage to the contractor's work arising out of such work. However, the policy language makes an exception and gives back coverage for such property damage lawsuits if the damaged work was performed on behalf of the insured contractor by his subcontractor. In other words, this property damage exclusion does not apply to a builder that subs out its work. This meant that the General Liability policy provided much broader coverage to a general contractor as opposed to a subcontractor. But around 2004, most insurance carriers that provided general liability policies for builders started adding Exclusion CG 2294 or a similar endorsement to the policy. This takes away the special coverage exception for general contractors such as builders and leaves them without important coverage for property damage to their work. Exclusion CG 2294 has a far-reaching impact on builders. The reason is that a builder's work is the entire house. The best way to illustrate the extent of the risk to a builder is to look at an example where a sub installs faulty electrical wiring which later results in a fire that destroys the entire house and injures its occupants. Assume that the damages to the electrical wiring installed by the sub are $20,000, the damages to the rest of the house are $230,000, the damages to the contents are $125,000, and injuries to the occupants will result in damages of $500,000. Under this example, assuming that the electrical sub carries his own general liability policy at the time of the fire, his policy will pay for all damages except for the $20,000 of damages to the electrical work that he installed. Remember, his own policy has a property damage to his work exclusion that will preclude coverage for damage to his own work. If the builder has Exclusion CG 2294 on the policy, such policy will not cover the remaining $20,000 of damage for the electrical work. As a result, both the electrical sub and/or builder will share out-of-pocket liability of $20,000. Now, assume that at the time of the fire, the electrical sub does not carry a general liability policy because he went out of business shortly after the house was completed. If Exclusion CG 2294 is on the builder's policy, the builder will have coverage for the damages attributable to both the contents and bodily injury to the occupants, but he won't have any coverage for property damage to the faulty electrical work or for the resulting damages to the rest of the house. This amounts to $250,000 of out-of-pocket exposure. Some carriers offer less severe versions of CG 2294. One carrier that we represent has a less severe version, still excludes damage to the faulty work itself, but will cover resulting property damage to the non-faulty work. In the fire example, this policy would not cover the $20,000 of damages to the faulty electrical work, but would cover the resulting $230,000 in damages to the rest of the house. Also, carriers that use CG 2294 may offer a buyback option in some states to builders that qualify based on their favorable loss records and the use of mandatory subcontractor agreements. One carrier that we represent will offer a CG 2294 buyback for a surcharge of approximately 12%. This buyback has a policy limit of $250,000 and each claim is subject to a $5,000 deductible. If you have CG 2294 on your policy, I highly recommend that you purchase the buyback or take a look at another carrier that offers a less severe version that allows coverage for resulting property damage to non-faulty work. As we've discussed, Exclusion CG 2294 cuts off coverage for construction defect claims for builders. However, there is another way that builders can lose coverage for construction defect. The court system can take away coverage by adverse rulings that set precedent. Under the general liability policy, coverage must be triggered by bodily injury or property damage resulting from an occurrence. An occurrence is synonymous with the term accident. Many courts rule that faulty construction is not an accident and thus not covered under a general liability policy. An accident is defined by the use of terms such as unexpected result, unforeseen, and not planned. These courts reason that faulty workmanship, that is the ordinary and natural consequence of failure to comply with contractual and governmental regulations, is not an accident. Other courts have ruled that the general liability policy was not meant to act as a warranty or performance bond for faulty construction, and as a result, faulty workmanship is not an occurrence. I disagree with the logic behind the court cases that rule that faulty workmanship is not an accident. I think that most contractors that have claims intended to perform the work properly but unknowingly made some type of mistake that resulted in a problem. Therefore, I believe that these claims are unexpected and are accidents as a result. But my opinion really doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that the courts in about 1/3 of the states have ruled that property damage to a contractor's own work resulting from faulty workmanship is not an occurrence and not covered as a result. In South Carolina, the state Supreme Court has flip-flopped on this issue over the past several years. As of the date of this video, the Supreme Court has ruled that resulting property damage to non-faulty work is an occurrence. You need to be aware of the position of your state on the issue of the no occurrence claim denial, as this will have a major bearing on your coverage for construction defect. Here are some strategies for protecting yourself against construction defect litigation. First, find out if you have Exclusion CG 2294 on your policy. If you do, inquire about purchasing a buyback or ask to get a quote from another carrier that has a less restrictive version that provides coverage for resulting damage to non-faulty work. Second, practice contractual transfer through the use of a very good subcontractor agreement. We can provide an excellent form for you to use. The subcontractor agreement should include mandatory insurance requirements for the sub, including work comp and general liability. Each policy must meet certain minimum specs. Quality general liability insurance carried by your subs is your first and best line of defense against construction defect lawsuits. In addition, the agreement should contain a hold harmless indemnification provision in your favor. Third, attempt to do business only with subs that have been in business for a number of years and have an excellent reputation for quality workmanship and standing behind their work. These subs are more likely to be in business over the long term, which makes it more likely that they'll continue to carry a general liability policy that will be in force for years into the future. Remember, the policy will only respond to lawsuits if it's in force at the time of the occurrence of the bodily injury or property damage. A lot of builders don't understand this, and they mistakenly think that the sub's coverage can be triggered merely by being in force when the work occurred. Fourth, consider using a homeowner's warranty product on the sales of all new home starts. Many experts believe that the dispute resolution services that are provided by these warranties help to prevent construction defect lawsuits. Also, at least one homeowner warranty product provides coverage for soil movement claims. Fifth, if you have concerns about the common exclusions for EFS, mold, or pollution, policies can be purchased from the high-risk marketplace to cover these exposures. Most of the minimum premiums are in the $2,500 to $5,000 range, and prices can increase from there depending on the amount of work that you'll be performing. And finally, make sure that you have a well-documented file and keep complete records, including certificates of insurance from subs, as well as subcontractor agreements. Also, it often pays to be willing to spend several $1,000s to make a claim go away as opposed to standing on principle. You need to protect your insurance loss record to make sure that future coverage is affordable and available. Hopefully, the information in this video will help you to better understand how to protect yourself from construction defect lawsuits. Please contact my office and ask for our contractor department if you have any remaining questions. Thanks for your time.